go ahead and get started. I'm Samm Sacks. I'm a senior fellow in the Technology Policy Program here at CSIS. We've got a great discussion today. Thank you to BSA, the Software Alliance, for their partnership in putting on this event. What I'll do is give a few opening remarks to set the stage, and then we'll go into a moderated Q&A and then open it up to questions from the audience. So what we wanted to do today was to talk about what we're seeing. Governments around the world are grappling with immense challenges, from online privacy, securing cyberspace, thinking about management of cross-border data flows, and we're beginning to see convergence around these issues at a time which is pretty pivotal. So GDPR is set to take effect in May. We have China's own burgeoning data protection regime gaining momentum, also set to take effect in May, their first data protection standard. The US passed the Cloud Act. There's so much going on as governments around the world are moving forward with these new policy challenges. And at the same time, there is growing risk of fragmentation and conflict as policymakers grapple with how to balance these different issues, right? And so we're seeing not just an impact in terms of national security as governments take different approaches to dealing with these issues, but impacts on global markets, on the ability of companies to operate across borders. And so we wanted to bring together a group of experts to talk about what are the different regional models that we're beginning to see emerge to these policy challenges, and how can this create fragmentation, but what are the pathways for convergence and greater harmonization on these topics? So to talk about these issues, we have a great group of experts: Chris Painter, former cyber coordinator at State Department. Helen Popp from the Estonian Embassy actually was Chris's counterpart at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Estonia, now leads the digital policy and economic portfolio there. Tommy Ross from BSA, Senior Director for Policy, and Jay Gullish, who is the Senior Director for Digital Economy, Media, and Entertainment at the US-India Business Council, previously in charge of digital economy at the US Embassy in New Delhi. So I think we'll be able to both dive deep regionally and then begin to think about how these different policy systems are interacting with one another. So Chris, I want to start with you. Can you help us sort of set the stage in thinking about some of these challenges as we look at governments' approaches to cybersecurity globally? How can cybersecurity be both sort of a positive and a potentially sort of negative force from a security and also a sort of enterprise commercial level?
So first of all, nice to be here with you and the gang and all of you here at CSIS. First, I would say mostly cybersecurity and the movement we've seen, the changes we've seen over the last 10 years or even longer than that, have been a positive thing. I often have said when I was in government, and still occasionally say, that cyber is now the new black. Everyone cares about cyber. Everyone cares about cybersecurity. It used to be this niche issue. It still has some of these characteristics, this niche policy issue, niche technical issue. But increasingly, governments are seeing it as a national security issue, a core issue of their national security, a core issue of their economic security as well, and that's really important that those two are blended. And that means there's increased awareness, not just at the technical and middle-level official level, but even at the senior political levels. And we've seen a number of countries around the world create national cybersecurity strategies. Again, that's very good. It signals that political commitment, but also helps the organization. They've built institutions like computer security incident response teams, and that's an important institutional thing. They've been cooperating more internationally. And I think recently we've also seen more cooperation against shared threats, things like the NotPetya worm or WannaCry, where there's been some joint attribution and even some thought about how countries might collaborate to react to them. So those are all good, but at the same time, there are a lot of challenges, as Sam said, and on a number of different fronts. On the human rights side, there are more repressive regimes who use cybersecurity and cybersecurity policy as a way really to repress human rights and repress speech and restrict data flow, and that's really significant. On the economic side, And that back on the human rights side for a second, a lot of countries talk about information security versus cyber security. I mean, they're trying to control information. On the more economic side, we have a number of countries, because there's been so much awareness around this, focusing on different policies and regulatory regimes to deal with what they see as these problems and these challenges. And the problem with that is they can be conflicting, or they could be incompatible. And they can be more localized and international, and those all cause problems. We have possible unintended consequences of different regulatory regimes. Sam mentioned the GDPR, which I'm sure we'll get into more later as well. And the GDPR has a lot of positive aspects in terms of protecting privacy and even cybersecurity. But also, one of the things that we've heard out of the White House recently and DHS is it has, I suspect, this unintended consequence of affecting something called the Who Is database, which is a database that's maintained by ICANN, the International Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which allows a lot of researchers and others and companies to really tackle a lot of cybercrime, spam and botnets and other things. And it'd be much harder to do that if that database is taken offline, and that could be a consequence of, and I assume unintended consequences of GDPR. And then you have this challenge between international standards, which are good, and more regional standards, regional or even local standards, which could be conflicting and really could be leading more to picking national winners rather than having really good international standards that would help the ecosystem as a whole. And then we see policies, as Sam mentioned, in China and other places where they're in the guise of cybersecurity policies, but in many ways they are really ways to restrict market access, to advance industrial policy, to this term we use, indigenous innovation, to encourage indigenous innovation. Again, that restriction hurts cybersecurity generally because you don't have the variety of products you need. And then finally, and we'll talk about this more too, you have the challenge of many more countries doing data localization in response to either law enforcement concerns or security concerns, but also, again, there are larger drivers for this in terms of controlling data, where many countries are trying to localize data in their jurisdiction. This is not something that's really particularly scalable. So you have this tension of the good and the challenging and the bad, and as we'll discuss this morning, I think we need to find a way through all of that.
And Tommy, I know you've done a lot of work looking at, across the world, the different models and approaches on the good and the bad, as Chris talked about.
And the ugly.
And the ugly. Can you help us understand sort of where you see some of the fault lines, where governments are taking different approaches to these issues?
Absolutely, and I think it's a really important question because it does, as you see different countries take on different approaches, it absolutely contributes to fragmentation and sort of international governance and international cooperation and international interoperability in terms of being able to carry out the sort of operational collaboration that Chris was referencing. One of the fault lines that Chris has mentioned is certainly around standardization. Many countries have embraced internationally recognized standards as the basis for their national cyber policies. Others have increasingly looked towards indigenous standards, regional or country-specific standards. That has pretty significant ramifications. As Chris said, it can contribute to picking national winners. It also, forces sort of it forces companies to often create market-specific products. And that can have the impact of undermining cybersecurity because it undermines the ability of security researchers to find vulnerabilities that are applicable to products around the world and therefore can create security solutions that are applicable to products around the world. And it undermines the interoperability of cybersecurity technologies and network technologies. A second major fault line, as Chris did already reference as well, is data localization. We've seen data localization measures that not only require data to be stored locally, but also limit the ability to transfer data across borders in a variety of countries around the world. And that has an impact on cybersecurity as well, because not only does it create inefficiencies in terms of data storage and increasing costs, which mean that companies and governments have to spend more money on data storage and therefore have less to spend on security, but it also limits the ability to apply tools, particularly cloud-based tools that depend on the free flow of data and big data analysis or data analytics that empower much more powerful cybersecurity solutions. I think a third area is domestic sourcing requirements. We're seeing countries consider and in many cases pass requirements that technologies be sourced to domestic providers, particularly for government and critical infrastructure networks. That obviously cuts off the ability of government and critical infrastructure entities to acquire the most globally competitive cybersecurity solutions, and so therefore can again undermine cybersecurity in those networks. And then finally, a fragmentation of internet governance. We see fragmentation in terms of standards, in terms of compliance requirements, and particularly in terms of governments increasingly seeking intrusive mechanisms to control content on the internet. And so all four of those things really create a divergence that undermines a strong international system that's really important for a secure internet ecosystem and also for the ability of countries to come together and combat what is truly a transnational threat in terms of malicious cyber activity.
So you mentioned data localization, and here I want to look at some specific regional models. India has pending regulation, which would be pretty impactful in terms of data localization. Jay, can you just tell us about how India is approaching these broader issues, and particularly when it comes to data localization?
Sure, thank you. Well, first, thank you, Sam, for having me here. It's a pleasure to see some friendly faces. First, I just want to start in context. Why is India important, and perhaps relative to other countries around the world that are grappling with these same issues? I think it comes down to scale, geopolitical, and then sort of leadership issues. On scale, India is clearly one of the largest countries in the world, a population of 1.3 billion people. It's also a fast-growing economy. And so as a market, it's just a very important destination given the size of its digital economy and how many global companies have set up there. In terms of geopolitical situations, it's a counterbalance to China. It's obviously a democracy, and therefore it sort of represents a sort of a Western style thinking about how the new world order will emerge in the digital age. And then the third thing is leadership. India has long been a leader in the G77 and has influence in a lot of the developing world. So how India kind of views itself and sort of develops its own policies, there's clearly going to be a lot of other countries that are going to either fall behind its shade or take India's positions as sort of a way for them to sort of introduce what they're thinking of doing as well. So when you take those three reasons together, how India evolves on these critical issues are really important. And I will get the data localization issue specifically, but from an India context, it's really a triangle, right? We've been talking about it. It's the issue of privacy, cybersecurity, and data flows. And each one of those impacts, the digital economy fundamentally in driving innovation and improving the lives and social well-being of everyone on this planet. And so from a data localization point of view, it's really right front and center in all of those three issues. So from an India perspective specifically, when they look at data localization, their natural tendency is to have a free, open, in a democracy and a market economy, they tend to really think at its core that moving data around is good. But there's a lot of counterbalancing, activities going on. One is on the national security side, where the original Manning and Snowden scandals sort of woke up the Indian government to the importance of cybersecurity and things of that nature, and be able to access the data from a national security point of view. I think it's important to note India is a very heterogeneous country, and so the types of things that pop up there are communal riots, and a lot of that is driven by social media, and it has a very different context than it does in the rest of the world. Then on privacy, you have a sort of obviously the Cambridge Analytica issue that has a special resonance in India. Not only did the opposition party utilize their services, But in the sting tape, if anyone saw this, the sting on Cambridge Analytica, they were talking about changing an election in Sri Lanka, and that's an area where India thinks about, its influence. And so now, therefore, it's not just a national security, it now becomes a political issue. And then on the commercial side, you have another scandal in India called the Nirav Modi scandal. It has nothing to do with the prime minister, but using some social media tools, fake fraudulent accounts. It was a big commercial scandal. So when you take each of those three things together, what you have is sort of a change in thinking about data localization. And so I think in the whole, while there's a bit of a reluctance to force localized data, there's also, I think, from a Government of India point of view, an understanding perhaps that some data needs to be localized, and then perhaps this has, it has national security benefits, it has some perhaps political benefits, and it clearly has commercial benefits. And so in the last, 3 to 6 weeks, there's been a bit of a toggle of at least the discourse and some policies, specifically around payment systems. Therefore, there's some new regulations coming into force. There was no public consultation about it. It just popped up literally on a Friday afternoon and gave digital payments companies 6 months to localize their data. The regulations are a little broad. It's not clear if it's all data and all transactions and all instances, whether or not mirroring is acceptable. And there's a number of issues that have emerged in that arena. And because it's such a quick timeline and deadline, there's a lot of questions about that. In other areas of the debate, for those of you who are watching India, there's clearly a conversation about privacy and a data protection law. And so this idea of data localization in some instances is sort of steeped into the conversation, and the news media is starting to talk about it a lot more, meaning specifically, quote, data localization, end quote. And so clearly, as an observer, there's clearly a change in thinking on the political level, probably coming from the highest levels of the government there.
And just as India is in the process of sorting this all out, China has draft measures on security assessments for the kinds of data that would have to undergo review before being sent out of the country. And I think that this is one thing that we're watching is these different regimes are all advancing on timelines that are very much aligned and in reference to one another. And I think countries are looking at the rise of these different models and saying, are we going to take the China model? Are we going to approach the European model? And so let's talk about what's going on in Europe. And Helen, and drilling down on Estonia in particular as a leader in the digital space, how is Estonia thinking about cybersecurity and digital economy policies?
Well, thank you for the question, Sam, and good morning. Well, Estonia is probably one of the most digitally dependent nation in the world. 99% of our public services are available online, which means, quite frankly, our livelihood, our economic well-being, etc., depends on ICTs. This is also, at least part of the reason why Estonia and Estonians take cybersecurity much more seriously than many other states. We have always known, but something that was reminded just in 2007 when Estonia became the first country, or at least the first country that decided to go public with the information, that faced some relatively serious cyber attacks motivated by politics. So the reminder we got was that if you live the e-lifestyle, if you are e-dependent, you are also e-vulnerable, and you have some e-responsibilities, let's say like that. And although Estonian approach to cybersecurity has always been that security must be part of the design process, we also understand that no service, whether online or offline, is ever completely secure. And for that reason, of course, we do have our core scenarios that we are preparing for, but in the long run, most probably, those are not going to help us. What we need and what we have been working for past 10, 15 or more years is trying to create a culture that is adaptive, flexible, and can respond in case of crisis. And something we also pay a lot of attention is training and exercise. Just to give you an example, long before the 2007 attacks happened, we already had discussion going on that since we are so e-dependent already, sooner or later, living in a tough neighborhood as we are, we're gonna be attacked. And for that, we thought that the attacks might come during our e-elections that we had in March 2007. So a month before the attacks actually happened. And yes, that was actually the second time when our citizens had an opportunity to vote online and to use internet-based voting. And for that purpose, we decided to carry out an exercise. We also included our private sector. Actually, a memorandum of understanding was signed with several critical firms, bank, telecoms, and so on. And most importantly, an information exchange process was set up. At the end, elections passed smoothly, but what the exercise helped was to put people at the senior level of government the right mindset. Just one more thing about the elections, since I just checked that yesterday. In 2007, we had 3% of people who cast their vote using internet voting. In our last elections, last fall, the percentage was a little bit more than 30%. So it has been going up quite nicely. But yes, I guess one of the lessons from Estonia is that while you are under attack, there are not very many good solutions. All you can do is train, and then train some more.
Let's talk about broader Europe and how they're thinking about these issues. And so much is going on that front. Chris, can you tell us about sort of how you think about Europe's approach, touching on some of the themes?
Yeah, Europe has been very active. It's a many-splendored thing. There's many things going on in Europe. So just to lay out some of them, obviously everyone's heard about the GDPR, and that seems to be the thing that's sucking all the oxygen. Everyone knows about that. And that's significant because it's really protecting privacy, but it also has a cybersecurity component in terms of, if there is a breach of personal data, and that there could be substantial penalties. First of all, there's a duty to report that to the supervisory authority within 72 hours. And then, like other breaches of the GDPR, the potential penalties are huge. They could be 2 to 4% of your gross, basically, which is a huge amount. And so this is something with a lot of teeth. There's a lot of other complexities in the GDPR, but it's interesting that it has this security component as well to protect data. There's also, back in October, there was something called the Joint Communication on Deterrence, Resilience and Defense. That this is the update to the EU's cybersecurity strategy, which came out back in 2011, I think, which was a joint strategy among 3 of the big EU directorates, the External Action Service, DG Home, and DG Connect, which set out the European policy, which was very similar to the US policy in our international strategy. This one updates that, and I think it's a very good document. It talks about the need for deterrence, it talks about the need for international cooperation, the need for public-private partnerships. All of those things are really important. Then there is the first piece of EU legislation dedicated to cybersecurity, and this is the Network Information Security Directive. And this has sort of gotten not as much play. I mean, I think it's been overshadowed by GDPR, and I think a lot of companies and others are not really ready for what the NIS might mean. Now, different than the GDPR, which has instantaneous effect when it comes implemented, this is something that each of the member states of the EU has to then implement it in their national law. So that creates, because there's some vagueness in the NIS, that creates some potential for conflict as different countries are implementing it potentially in different ways. But generally, it's a very good piece of legislation as well. It talks about the need for more cooperation between CSIRTs among EU countries. It talks about the need for, it's not prescriptive by nature. It's not trying to prescribe how critical infrastructure protects itself. It really deals with, unlike the GDPR, this deals with what we call here critical infrastructure, what the EU's called essential services. which each of the countries can then designate what they are, and it provides certain expectations that those essential services will be protected. And again, there are fines, although two things. One, the reporting requirement is immediate if it's a significant enough incident. But two, those fines have not been defined, not like the GDPR, so the member states are trying to figure those out. But that's still important. That creates a higher level bar. As I said, it deals with essential services, but also interestingly deals with something called digital services. That includes digital services operating outside the EU that have customers or effects in the EU. And that could be everything from search engines like Google and others to cloud providers to everything else. So it has pretty wide application, and it'll be very interesting to see how that actually gets implemented. Coming out of that is still another thing which is pending right now, which I think is really significant too, which is the Cybersecurity Act that's now wending its way through the very complicated EU process where you have the Council, which are sort of the member states, you have the Parliament, which has 3 different committees looking at this. So it's very complicated. They're going through various different iterations right now. And that is important because it's trying to create a certification standard for ICT products in the EU. And that can have very far-ranging implications. First of all, ICT products is a very broad term. Secondly, and it's not been really well defined yet what that means, so it could have very broad application. And it raised a number of issues. Right now, these are voluntary certification standards, which is great. But there's still some people made speeches about wanting to make them mandatory, and that gets to the conflict issues we talked about before. Second, there's this question of whether these are going to be European standards or international standards. Obviously, and I should say, since leaving the government, I still have my government perspective, but also been doing some work with the private sector, including a company called Palo Alto Networks and others. So I now see both of the sides of this, and I think the real drive for having international standards rather than local standards is important. And local standards, as we said earlier, could be a way to pick national or regional winners or losers rather than the best of breed things that you want. And to build these kind of standards, even though voluntary, you want to include industry and others from the beginning in that decision-making process. You don't want to simply layer these on. So I think that's going to be another challenge going forward. So there's a number of things that I think create possible risks there. It also could be a real benefit in terms of saying, how do you do these certificates in the EU? Could that spread other places in a way that makes sense? One interesting thing is Andreas Ansip, your countryman from Estonia, who is the vice president of the EU, who does all the digital services issues, was at the RSA conference in San Francisco last week. And he said during his speech that he wanted to have joint cooperation between the US and the EU on setting these kinds of standards, which is the first time anyone had heard that. And that's actually, and who knows if that's actually the policy, but he said that, and I think that generated a lot of interest that maybe this is something, and it'll be very complicated to do, that we wouldn't just have these regional buckets of standards, but we'll try to do something that is more international.
And let's definitely get back to the question of international coordination on standards in the latter part of the discussion, because I think that's going to be one of the important pathways that we can look at for building more harmonization around this. Tommy, did you want to add anything from?
Let me just add one more thing. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned earlier that, like all these competing models, a lot of countries are looking at the various EU activities, and indeed the EU wants other countries to look at it. So it's important what happens there, because that could be something that gets broader application.
Absolutely, and I think that we're seeing this with the EU and with China coming to the forefront as sort of the 2 most compelling models on these emerging policy challenges. Tommy, did you want to add anything from an industry perspective on specific challenges to the sort of suite of initiatives moving forward in Europe, for where industry is sort of the most focused?
Sure. A few quick points. One, I would say, what you just said, Sam, about the EU model and the China model sort of becoming the most compelling models out there for other countries around the world to look at. U.S. policymakers should listen to that statement and be a little bit alarmed that the United States is not included, right? And I think that's something that is going to be an increasingly interesting dynamic in the international community going forward. Is the EU and China are moving forward with such great pace in terms of, and breadth in terms of their activities around cybersecurity governance, and the United States has certainly been a leader in this space for many years, but is not continuing to generate new dynamic approaches to cybersecurity governance in the way that those other two regions are, and what that will mean for how the international system is shaped in the future will be really interesting to watch. That's point number one. With regard to the EU, I think Chris laid it out really well. If you think about sort of GDPR, if you boil it down to thinking about that as a data security measure, NIS is focusing on essential services, the EU Cybersecurity Act really focusing on the consumer marketplace. That's an area that the EU really is the first or among the first to enter. We don't have any good models internationally for how governments can drive and potentially even regulate, which I know many in the EU are looking at, the consumer marketplace for cybersecurity. And so it will almost automatically become a model for the rest of the world to look at, and so it's really important they get it right. International standards and how international standards interact with EU certification regimes under this legislation are, in my mind, clearly the most important debate around this legislation. BSA has been pretty deeply engaged with the European Commission and the European Parliament as this has taken shape, and I feel pretty confident that the European Commission embraces international standards as the intended basis for their vision here, and is supportive of international standards, of the primacy of international standards in this scheme. However, there are pressures within member states to be more sort of inward-looking and to embrace country-specific standards as the basis for EU certification schemes. How that gets sorted out will have a really significant impact, not just on the cybersecurity landscape in Europe, but on the strength of the international standards system globally, I think, in years to come, because of the market power that Europe brings and how much it will shape how companies react, not just in Europe, but in the development of their products globally. The other thing that is important to watch here, I think, in terms of fragmentation, is that there is also a debate about to what extent the EU certification schemes under this act should have primacy over national certification schemes, whether they should supplant them. And obviously, if that is not the case, and you have an EU certification scheme that is added to a bunch of other national certification schemes, you are contributing to fragmentation rather than generating harmonization, which was the stated intent of the European Commission in this exercise. So those two questions are going to be extremely important to watch as we move forward, and will have, as I said, significant ramifications for cybersecurity in the EU and more globally.
Let's go back to Asia for a moment, because we have draft cybersecurity laws moving forward in places like Vietnam, in Singapore. There's discussion about, and data governance in particular has been a big focus, with more countries looking to the APEC CBPR, cross-border protection rules, as Asia's sort of answer to a privacy framework. Jay, can you talk a bit about how India is thinking about CBPR? I know there's been a big push both from government, US government, and from industry to think about CBPR as a possible way to create more international interoperability around data governance issues as data localization gains steam. How is India thinking about CBPR?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. India as a country, they're deep into thinking about privacy and data protection and cross-border data rules. There's a clear understanding that Digital India, which is an initiative launched by the current government, is where India wants to be. There's a vision, it's digitalization, it's how to move India into the cutting edge developer and user of a whole variety of different technologies. Everything from not only connectivity, obviously, but all the way through leadership in AI and blockchain and e-governance services. There's also a recognition that India is probably the largest holder of global data, in the sense that corporations have huge outsourcing operations there. And so there's processing of a significant amount of data already. And that's on the corporate side. And a lot of the concerns are coming out of the consumer side. And so they are looking at this carefully. I think they're going to be very measured in their response. Obviously, the cross-border protection rules coming out of the APEC organization are compelling in a way. Because unlike China, that is compelling industry to respond, unlike GDPR, that compels companies to do things in a certain way, the cross-border data protection rules actually allow sort of a bottoms-up thinking flexibility. And in that sense, if you combine it with sort of the NIST Cyber Framework Agreement, which I think by all accounts people would agree was a truly open process and developed a highly utilized and useful tool that's still evolving, I'm sort of looking at the APEC regime as sort of doing something similar on privacy and finding, and cross-border data rules, and finding that right mix over a period of time rather than having very clear standards and a checklist that you have to go through. Because both privacy and cybersecurity in a way, and we've all seen this, companies will have incredible rules, whether it's audit rules or financial rules. It doesn't mean they're not broken. So just getting that sort of compliance down in a checklist isn't a culture. And what we need to think about, and I'm hoping that the Indian government and people start to think about how do we develop a privacy culture, and that also has responsibilities for people to think about how do I want to use various services, how do I engage the companies that have my data, whether it's utilities or banks or Facebook or other, and how are they using it, and have some responsibility there. So as they look through this, India has a natural tendency to look at European regimes, a former colony, a lot of the lawyers train there. It sort of has a nice fit. But then there's also a large number, and industry sort of understand the dependency that India has on cross-border data flows. And then Indian citizens love social media. And so they're starting to understand the impacts there. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to sort of share the various models and for India to think about perhaps a different way that sort of comes in between the two and perhaps can obviously, I think Europe is forcing everyone to adhere to GDPR at some level. But I think there's some understanding that there are impacts, whether it's on innovation and startups and new technology rolling out, and there's concern that that could stifle a very dynamic sector of the Indian economy that really is going to position itself going forward. So this debate is going on as we speak in India, so I think it's a great opportunity. GDPR is going to be in place. The cross-border privacy rules are sort of emerging. You have the NIST framework that's sort of gaining some traction. You have some new thinking out of Europe, and I'm hoping that India throws this all into the cauldron, mixes it up, and comes out with some nice magic that can help a variety of different countries. Because again, going back, that they will provide a lot of leadership and coverage to countries, and find something that sort of bridges all of this without going one way or the other.
And this debate about privacy is also happening in China, and I think that that's becoming, we're starting to see that more and more, in a world where the concept of privacy is not one that I think most people would think of in China's digital economy. After the Facebook scandal a few weeks ago, there was a big uproar in Chinese social media. The head of Baidu came out and said, well, in China, users are more comfortable trading sensitive information for convenience. And immediately after, there was a big outcry on Chinese social media. I think within several days, 12,000 people had voted on this Weibo poll and said, no, he's wrong. He's out of touch with this growing awareness about privacy in China. And meanwhile, China is moving forward. May 1st, their first data protection standard takes effect. There's still a lot of uncertainty around what exactly that's going to mean. I mean, my view of it is that it's probably going to be more about putting checks on Chinese companies that are handling increasing amounts of data. Meanwhile, the government is sort of on its own track when it comes to data protection, and under the cybersecurity law is getting more and more access to Chinese user data, but that's a separate issue. But I think it's important to recognize that this debate is also playing out in China, and they're watching what's going on around the world. The Chinese government saw the passage of the Cloud Act at a time when they're finalizing their own cross-border data transfer measures, and that's impacting the way that that's going to play out. Chris, have you any thoughts about the Cloud Act to bring that into the discussion and how that's impacting these issues globally?
I mean, one of the things that we found, especially when I was at the State Department, is almost every country we talked to was frustrated, and this led to this data localization issue too, was one of the reasons for it, of getting information from providers in the US, where just naturally a lot of the information is, and that's because, at least at the moment, a lot of that's concentrated in big providers in the US who have servers in the US. Now that will change over time as more countries have more services come up over time where not everything will get stored here, but a lot of it's stored here. So the issue is if you have, you take the UK because this is the kind of pilot agreement on this, you have a UK citizen who's talking to a UK citizen, they commit a crime in the UK, but the data is stored at servers in Redmond. That makes it very difficult because you have to go through a fairly long process, a mutual legal assistance process with the US, and those kinds of things, being a recovering lawyer, are never quick, right? You can speed them up, but they're still never that quick. You can speed them up in emergencies, but still in the normal case, it's hard. So that led a lot of countries to say, and Brazil and India were good examples of this, who had this frustration, well, this is why we need to localize all this data here so that we can have access to it, and this is a frustration we have. And so the Cloud Act was meant to alleviate some of this and allow a way for governments to go directly to the providers and get this information. It was really based originally on a discussion with the UK. But there are some limitations of it as well. I mean, the Cloud Act will allow this kind of escape valve so that if a country has adequate due process protections and privacy protections, you can arrange an agreement with those countries to allow that kind of passage of information. The problem is that not every country will have the same kind of due process protections that the US has, or have adequate privacy protections, or at least that people think of privacy in this sense, even though it's largely applicable to their own citizens. So, this is going to be a process where I think countries are going to be put in the position of, if you want to take advantage of this, which will help you in law enforcement and other data, that you have to meet certain standards, and that may well require them to change their laws. And I know of no country that's that keen on changing their own laws generally, and it's not always that easy, as it's not easy for us. So that still presents somewhat of a problem, but it is a way for countries to be able to get this data and get beyond this argument, which has really been going on for 20 years, and not an illegitimate one either, where countries want this. So I think it does help alleviate some of the problems. It helps address some of the data localization problems. It does help address some of the law enforcement jurisdictional problems that have been issued. There's also some other methods that are being used more informally. There's something called the Internet Jurisdiction Project, which has been looking at ways to do certain voluntary transfers. But for a lot of these transfers, there are legal impediments, and you have to get beyond them. In the US, it's the ECPA, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. So interestingly, Europe thinks the US has very low privacy protections, but indeed here we have higher privacy protections than almost anyone else, and that's causes this kind of conflict.
How are people in Estonia watching these debates play out globally, and how is Estonia thinking about data governance in this context?
Well, let me maybe zoom back a little bit and talk about the international cooperation and cyber issues in more general. Well, when in 2007 Estonia was very much a lone voice in desert raising alarm, then things have changed quite a bit in past 10 years then. By today we have 2 UNGG reports, United Nations Cyber Expert Group reports, that have established or confirmed that international law applies in cyberspace. Extremely important, because remember that cyber is not a lawless domain. Then the OSCE has agreed on 3 sets of CBMs, the confidence building measures. And I think the OSCE is a good model because it has a large number of member countries. And now there are some other regional organizations, ASEAN and Organization of American States, that are looking into creating some international norms as well. And of course, there has been a lot of progress at the EU and NATO as well. As we know, NATO declared cyber as an operational domain of warfare just recently. But nevertheless, what we also see is a division between countries, and this is coming very clear. No secret that countries have different objectives. Russia and China are stressing the importance of sovereign control, while many democracies press for a more open internet. And the last UNGG that concluded their work in 2017 was not actually able to come a consensus. So there was no report, and the reason being that although we have all agreed that international law applies, we cannot really agree how exactly does it apply. Because there are some countries that feel that cyber is so special and unique that we need to start writing new laws. And we don't really agree with that. We do have a Budapest Convention for cybercrime. We have the international humanitarian law that has set principles of behavior during the conflict, and then other international and laws as human rights law and others that apply. Yes, in future we might come to a conclusion that we might need some additional pieces of international law, but we are definitely not there yet. We need to start applying what we actually do have, and we know it's not an easy. When it comes, jurisdiction is very clear when we talk about real life, very complicated when it comes to cyber issues. But we feel that the number one way we can enhance cyber deterrence is to clarify international law, so that the ones that conduct cyber operations know that there would be cost imposed when they violate international law. And it goes without saying that for a small country, international law really matters. It gives us predictability, it gives us some kind of security. So that's important. And those are the debates that we are right now putting a lot of effort in.
Yeah, I should just note that that's very important, because the idea that existing law applies, you don't have to create something all new for cyberspace, is part of this. We have some international law in this area, and this goes to the fragmentation point that, if we have this law that we've all agreed to, why can't we apply that to cyberspace rather than create something new? And there has been efforts in the EU to come up with similar tools that we have in the US. They recently had something called the Diplomatic Toolkit, which came out, which is something that allowed them to think about sanctions in cyber cases and others. So there's been some convergence, but at the same time, there's also been pulls by some countries to pull this apart.
So what are recommendations that you have both to US policymakers, but to others around the world in terms of moving more towards this kind of convergence? What are the pathways for facilitating more interoperability? Anyone can take it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would start with the Cloud Act. I mean, I think it's a great concept. I think those conversations need to happen quickly so that those individual treaty negotiations can impact the debate. Because if you were to say how long, and I'd ask Chris to kind of consider this as well, how long will it take to negotiate 1, 2, the first dozen, right? And so we're looking at this, the privacy and data localization debate is sort of going to be answered in the next, certainly handful of years, of probably a couple of fingers. So does the Cloud Act, which will have a net positive, will it influence how countries think about this issue? And moving quickly to start some of those negotiations, perhaps multiple negotiations, might be able to influence debate very quickly. The second thing is on the two sort of international frameworks that I've mentioned that I think are very positive. I think there needs to be a greater push to educate the communities around those. The NIST Cyber Framework Agreement, they just came out with a new version. I think it's very positive. I think that needs to sort of be, I don't want to be shared with other countries and how that helps to actually pull in more international participants into that process, so that it's I think that'll help on the cyber side, and then on the cross-border privacy rules as well, to try to figure out a mechanism how to include non-APEC countries into that. I think that should be a discussion, and if there was an onboarding process or an easier way to connect other countries into that framework, I think that would be very, very helpful.
Tommy, any thoughts?
Sure. I think what we're essentially talking about is how do you build up a strong international system around cybersecurity governance? And in my mind, there's sort of five things we ought to look at. Norms. I think Helen did a really good job of laying out why norms in cyberspace are important. It's an area that is becoming increasingly difficult, but no less important. 2 is standards. We've talked a lot about international standardization, and I think that governments and industry can both do more to inject energy into the international standards development process to make sure that standards are sufficient and that we're identifying and addressing gaps in international standards. And I think then obviously building national policies around those internationally recognized standards goes hand in hand with that. 3 is international law, and again, I think Helen made some, and Chris made some very good points around building up international law and common understandings of its application to cybersecurity challenges. 4 is mechanisms that allow for collaboration, and Jay was just touching on this. I think the Cloud Act is a very good example of an important mechanism that allows countries to work together on legitimate law enforcement investigations. CBPR and GDPR function as mechanisms that allow for cross-border data transfers that also protect data in that process. Those kinds of mechanisms are going to be increasingly important to address some of the policy concerns that are legitimately held by governments about how data is being treated and secured in an international environment. And then I think 5th is governance. The U.S. government under Chris, had a really strong role in cyber diplomacy and engaging with foreign governments to guide them towards best practices for governing cyberspace. That is a really important role in the United States. It's a really important role in other countries as well. It's also an important place that industry can play a role, and this is something BSA has sought to do. We engage with governments around the world precisely to encourage them to adopt best practices. Some of you may have seen as you walked in the door, we have a new international cybersecurity policy framework on the table out there that is intended very much to lay out what we see as best practices for cybersecurity governance, where governments should be considering cyber policies and how to approach those cyber policy questions most effectively. Industry is doing a lot in that realm. Government is in the United States and elsewhere has played an important role, and I think that's a role that needs to be emphasized on both industry and government sides as more and more countries consider their national cybersecurity policy foundations.
Yes, and I think something that hasn't been mentioned too much, but the European Union new cybersecurity strategy is also a very interesting case. The core message that the new European Union cybersecurity strategy carries is that from 2017, the cyber threats are considered to be the core threats to the functioning of the European Union. What we are planning to do is to pay much more attention to prevention, on capabilities, and also on response. And we are also planning to step up work to detect, trace, and hold accountable those responsible for cyber threats. And here I really have to commend the US that you have done a lot in this field in last months. But something I wanted to mention, and I think that is really, really important, is that the European Union is also planning to set up a capacity building network between all the European Union stakeholders, and then also have some capacity building guidelines worked out. Because if you look at the big picture, there are still several million potential new internet users coming online in next few decades probably. And most of them are joining us from outside so-called Western club or technologically advanced world. Right now, we think we still have a chance and opportunity to have a discussion with them and set some standards and have some kind of leadership role there. Because as it has been mentioned here before, the standard setting is now the new avenue where everyone wants to have a say, and many countries would like to become the leading power in standard setting. So having those discussions with developing countries and engaging them more is extremely important.
So I'd say there are a number of things that are foundational. One, just I agree that we need to negotiate these other agreements on the Cloud Act. The problem is it's a bandwidth issue, so it's going to be hard to do them. And if they do require changes in law, that's not going to happen quickly. So that's just going to be one of the impediments. I do think we have to continue to press for the acceptance of the application of international law for certain norms in cyberspace. I think that's foundational. I think we also have to be willing to live with some fragmentation. I just think this is going to happen. I think no matter what our best efforts are, there are going to be different regimes that are going to be formed in different parts of the world, and we're going to have to try to make sure that those are as interoperable as possible and just deal with the uncertainty that's going to create. And that's unfortunate, but it's just true. And I think I would love that if every country around the world adopted the NIST framework and NIST 2.0 now. And I know my former colleagues and friends at NIST, Adam and others have been very active in going around the world talking to anyone who will hear them, and almost everyone wants to hear them, which is good. Yeah. But nevertheless, you have the rise of these different regulatory regimes out there. And for me, what that means is two things. One, which was mentioned before, really engaging in a strategic way with these other countries and these other bodies who are looking at these things. And that's in various different levels. Certainly at the government level. I think these are not one-off discussions. You don't have a discussion, for instance, with the EU and go away for a couple of years. You have to have a constant discussion, both at the embassy level and at the capital level, not just the US, but others. And that has to be an engaged discussion to try to make sure that to the extent possible, you're communicating what the concerns are. And a lot of, right now I mentioned the Cybersecurity Act is in Parliament in the EU. They've been, I think, receptive to asking people, industry and others, for possible amendments. And I think that's just like in our Congress. So that's something you want to take advantage of but not leave on the table. And it's not just governments, as Tommy had said, this is industry too. And you want, when we did a lot of our dialogues, we tried to have industry as part of our dialogues. We'd have maybe a government day and industry day, but we try to get those things on the table because a lot of that interaction is going to be from industry. And getting these governments and the people who are doing these standards and these other policies to talk to not just their own industry, but really talk to the international industry on these issues, because this is not something that is borderless. And it is something that is borderless and not as just located in a particular industry. It's interesting, in Europe at one point I heard from a lot of decision makers that we hear from the US industry all the time, we never hear from our own. And I think that's changed. I think some of the European industry has become much more active in engaging the EU. There was this thing that came out of the Munich Security Conference that was a agreement among a lot of the end user industries, Airbus and others, Siemens, to uphold cybersecurity and engage on these issues. You had the Microsoft Tech Accord recently. I think those are good things to try to plug into these processes. And then I go to Helen's point on capacity building. There are, I think, different camps on this issue. I mean, I think we're not going to convince China and Russia necessarily to change their ways because they have different imperatives in terms of regime stability and other issues that they're trying to promote. We can have an impact on policies, and we should engage with China. I think that's really important. However, a lot of the countries around the world, especially developing countries, are on the brink, trying to decide. They're on the fence of what systems they're going to do and what policies they're going to adopt, particularly as they're getting broadband and other connectivity. And I think it'd be stupid for us not to engage with those countries and engage with them really in a very robust manner, because if we don't do that, other countries will. And these countries do like the idea of stability, but they also like the idea of economic growth. So capacity building, I think, for the future is an important component, not just by, again, governments, but by industry too, and making sure that we're getting these kind of interoperable standards and these interoperable policies around the world. I don't think this is an easy thing. I think, like I say, I think some fragmentation will happen, but I think this is really going to be an inflection point over the next few years.
I do think the Chinese industry is an important channel as well, and particularly on data issues, because you have global Chinese companies that are going global and need cross-border data flows and have been an important voice on that.
Well, and it's an interesting thing how that dynamic works. In Brazil, a number of years ago, they had something called their Marco Civil legislation, and as part of that at one point, it had a data localization provision. And that was removed before the final legislation went through, not because the US was pressing for it, we were pressing for it, but because their own industry was saying, this will make us less competitive. We can't, if we're providing services around the world, this is difficult for us. And I think that's an important point, that I think China's industry has a role in saying, if we apply these standards to us, that may make it harder for us to compete on the world stage.
Thank you. Well, let's open it up to questions. Just raise your hand and we'll come around with a mic. Here in the front.
Sure. Hi, I'm Deepak Maheshwari. I head government affairs for Symantec in India, ASEAN, and China. Happen to be in town, so pleasure to be here. So one thing that you mentioned, that Singapore has got a draft Cybersecurity Act. That's not the case. So in Singapore, actually, the Cybersecurity Act was passed by the Parliament on 8th February, and last month it's actually become a legislation. Okay, but yes, Singapore also had done a review of the PDPA, which is their Personal Data Protection Act, and some further development may happen. As far as India, of course, Jay has already mentioned many things about that, but I think one important thing there is also about that a lot of data of consumers does come to US, for example, from India. And as far as India is concerned, so that happens in terms of a B2C relationship, where typically the negotiation power does not lie with the consumers, whereas a lot of data that goes from US to India is typically in a B2B scenario where there's a lot of negotiating power. So that's one important aspect to be considered. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Derek Johnson. I'm a staff writer with Federal Computer Week. You all have talked here a little bit about international global fragmentation of cyber policy, but you could also argue that even here in our country, we have a fairly fragmented policy landscape, particularly as it comes to responding to nation-state cyber attacks. There's a lot of confusion even up on the Hill if you listen to hearings about sort of which agency is responsible for which aspect of cyber defense and offense. And I'm curious as to sort of what sort of international framework or standards we should be looking at when we are developing a formal policy around this. What we should be looking at. I don't want to say that we're sort of making it up as we go along, but it's sort of things are fairly I think unsettled in that area, and I was curious as to what you all thought and sort of what role our own fragmented cyber policy landscape may play in that going forward.
So I'll start with that maybe, and then just say, I think, I don't think we want a system where one ring rules them all, where we have just one point of contact which for everything, because I don't think that really works for us. But I do think you have to harness the different capabilities of the different agencies in a productive way, and they need to coordinate with each other. And that largely has been done out of the White House. Michael Daniels sitting behind you, he did that at one point. Rob Joyce, until, well, I guess he's still there, will shortly leave, which is unfortunate. But I think that's an important point. I do think that we need to work with other countries and have a plan going forward of how we deter some of the bad nation-state conduct that Helen mentioned as well as a lot of other different issues. And we can't be seen as fragmented when we're dealing with other countries. We are better coordinating within our country now, or at least we were when I left, than we had been a number of years ago. It's been a process, and that's been good. But that is in part, just building familiarity in the various communities, having strategies in place. Those have all been important things. Now, what I think we need to do a better job of is I'm glad we're doing the calling out of different countries recently for some of the bad state behavior they've done. I think we still need to do a better job of actually imposing consequences on those countries that actually make a difference. And I think that requires a lot more strategic thought. I also think that requires real partnerships with a lot of other countries. I was very happy to see the NotPetya attribution that was not just the US, but many countries involved, and WannaCry in the same way. But you need to follow them up and very quickly or at the same time with consequences that actually matter, because I think we're creating a norm of inactivity, that these are acceptable because no one does anything about it. And so that's where I think a lot of at the same time you have to be worried about escalation, you have to be worried about how it plays with the overall relationship. And I think the other thing we need to do is mainstream this issue as part of our national security and economic issues. I think it's still being seen, despite what I said before, as too much of a boutique issue. And when we reached the agreement with China, for instance, on theft of intellectual property, the only reason I think we were able to do that is that we didn't treat it as a cyber issue, we treated it as an economic and national security issue. And for a sustained time, we were willing to take friction in the overall relationship. We don't do that with other things in cyber yet. And so that requires not just an all of cyber approach within our government, but an all of government approach that pulls in the other agencies. Are we there yet? No. I think you need strong leadership at the White House to bring this together. We'll see what happens.
Janice Marconi, on what basis do we ban certain companies? Does the U.S. ban certain companies, whether it's Huawei or ZTE? Especially since I guess legislation has just been introduced as to what poses a security threat.
I can offer a few thoughts on that. I think that we, BSA, as I've said, we're engaged with governments around the world that consider similar questions and approach it in different ways. And there is an opportunity to see decisions to ban foreign companies from providing products to a government as driven by protectionism, economic protectionism, trying to promote domestic industry and that kind of thing. I think we want to avoid that. I think we want to make sure, certainly every country has a right to make national security decisions. What is important, I think, from our perspective, is that when those decisions are made, there be a transparent national security justification for those decisions so that information is communicated to the public that justifies the decision as something beyond a choice to push out foreign providers from competing for government contracts. I think that's essential. I think there are clearly reasons that we may want to avoid certain products because they may be infiltrated by foreign intelligence apparatuses, or because we know that they have significant security flaws. Or because we know that they, are comprised primarily of intellectual property that was stolen or acquired illegally. And so, I think there are clear justifications for those kinds of decisions. The most important point is how they are choreographed in terms of their presentation to the public.
I think even in the U.S., there's a difference between banning things in the federal networks or the core networks and banning them nationally. And I think it's been more advice on the latter and more prescriptive in the former. And then it becomes a risk management decision. What are the risks you're facing, especially if a nation state has control or possible control of an entity? What does that mean in terms of when you're in a time of crisis with that country? Can you mitigate those risks? You have to look at that. And if you can't, then you have to make a rational decision about what products and services that you're going to allow to be part of the core national security network of your country.
Hello, my name is Emil Losa de Siles with Technology and Cybersecurity Law Group. I wondered if you, first of all, thank you to CSIS, always a great discussion. I'm very pleased to see you from Estonia and also all of you. So I have a question about the, yes, all of you, Mr. Painter and industry representatives, yes. So I have a question, or requesting some commentary about the newly announced cybersecurity tech accord with Microsoft, of course, leading the way. Brad Little, their CEO, has long called for an international digital Geneva Convention about cybersecurity. And in that cyber tech accord, these 30 or so tech leaders are saying, well, we agree not to allow governments to utilize our private facilities to respond to attack or to attack. And I think that's also very interesting with respect to the Tallinn Manual and 2.0, trying to define what international law, what constitutes a cyber attack in those contexts. So I'd like some commentary on that, please. Thank you.
I can maybe start off there. I think the Tech Accord is an important example of something that we haven't talked maybe as much here about as we could, which is how how the community of industry stakeholders can sort of take governance into their own hands in a way, how they can contribute to creating international harmonization through private, business-to-business collaboration. And there have been a few examples that BSA's members have been involved in recently. The Tech Accord, there's an IoT Charter of Trust that Siemens and IBM and various other companies have been involved with, multinational, companies. There's something I'm going to probably butcher the name, but I think it's a coalition for cybersecurity responsibility that has come out. All three of these are efforts to generate greater collaboration across national boundaries in the private sector and in engagement with governments across national boundaries. And I think the kind of impacts they can have are pretty significant. When you're talking about the Tech Accord, obviously, the private sector is not going to direct how governments approach cyber warfare, but they can certainly make clear where they stand on the issues, and they can make it more difficult for a government to use private sector platforms to launch the kinds of attacks that the Tech Accord is aimed at stopping. It also contributes to the discussion more broadly about international norms of behavior in cyberspace, and I think that's really important. The IoT Charter of Trust is another good example where it's largely about creating baseline security standards throughout the supply chains of these major companies. And when you think about modern supply chains, they stretch across the entire world, through multiple different countries, multiple different companies, and being able to enforce consistent security baselines throughout that ecosystem, obviously contributes to a harmonization of approaches within the private sector, and has the added impact of encouraging companies to engage with their own governments to make sure that their policies are consistent with the requirements of the global supply chain.
One thing I'd say on the Digital Geneva Convention, which I've never been that thrilled with that concept for a couple of reasons I'll mention, is my sense is that Microsoft, and you'll have to ask them, have backed off that in terms of something that they originally was like, we need this immediately. But I think they've heard some of the concerns that there are countries, and this is certainly not their intent, China and Russia among others, who've been pushing for a UN convention for some time, but that's been more to control content, which they see as one of the big threats, and that's certainly not where Microsoft is going, but that's one of the dangers. And I think they understand that might be something, we might have some agreement in the far future, but right now, there's a lot of groundwork we need to do in building norms, building these other things, and I think that's good. So I think there's been an iterative discussion since Brad Smith first made that proclamation a year ago at RSA, and I think now they're taking perhaps a more realistic, more inclusive approach on that, separate from the Tech Accord. So I think those kinds of discussions are good, and this is important. You have to have these discussions with industry to find out how you can work together to achieve the kind of normative and international law setting that we all want.
Thank you. I think we're about at time. Excuse me. Feel free to continue the conversation after
She's
the
all
panel.
choked up then.
I am choked up. Thank you all for coming. We look forward to having you as part of this conversation as we go forward and track everything that is moving forward right now. It's a really pivotal moment on these issues. So thanks to our panelists.